There we go. There we go. Thank you again. Anyway, okay, and I'd like to start out reading this from Galatians 3. For through faith you are all sons of God in union with Christ Jesus, baptized into union with him. You have all put on Christ as a garment. There is no such thing as Jew and Greek, slave and freeman, male and female, for you are all one person in Christ Jesus. But if you thus belong to Christ, you are an issue of Abraham, and so heir by promise. And so let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for this day. We're thankful that Dr. Morgan has made it here, and be with the Larsons and be with us in a special way. We pray in your name. Amen. Okay, Dr. Morgan, I think you have a paper that you want to present to us today. And what we'll do is you take as long as you need, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And by the way, the sheriff in town today is Monty again. So anyway, so Dr. Morgan, go. It's to you.
All right. So now I'm going to try to share the screen.
Okay, I give you permission.
You give me permission to try. Oh, yeah. No, I have to have that. All right, thank you.
Okay, something's popped up. Okay, there you go.
Now, the problem that I run into, you see the title slide, don't you?
Yes.
I run into trouble sometimes getting the thing. No, okay, we're good. All right, I just wanted to try out moving it. All right, well, good morning once again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for this presentation. It's a real privilege and it's an honor really for me to be with you. So what I'd like to talk about today is entitled An American Original and America's Original Sin. The crisis over the color line in the nation's capital that embedded racial injustice in Adventism. I struggled with that subtitle, but that's what we're going with today. The crisis over the color line in the nation's capital that embedded racial injustice in Adventism. Now, I'd like to start with a couple quotes here. The man on the left, at least as I see the screen, is Arna Bontemps. Now, since this class originates in Southern California, might be interested to know that Bontemps grew up in Los Angeles. He was raised in the first African-American congregation organized really anywhere on the West Coast. Went to Pacific Union College, graduated, and then went to New York to teach at Harlem Academy, an Adventist school. But at the same time, he became a prominent figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He was an author and historian, social analyst, and so forth. He taught then at Oakwood for a while, and then at Shiloh Adventist Academy in Chicago. In 1950, he wrote, in response to a request, Ebony Magazine was doing a feature on various religious groups, new religious groups that African Americans were joining. And so he writes to the editor quite a bit of information about the Adventists. And this is what he writes in 1950. In race relations, Adventists are retarded. In other words, they're backward. But notice what he says next. In their early years, Adventists were solid on the race question, but then compromised to appease the South. Now, one interesting thing about this is that the General Conference president and grandfather of Roy Branson, this is William Henry Branson, W.H. Branson, in 1954, just 4 years later, the Brown versus Board of Education case is before the Supreme Court. It's pending, but there is the widespread sense that the segregation, the separate but equal ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 was going to be struck down, but they really wanted a unanimous vote, and that's what they got eventually. So there was kind of this lag time, and in that lag time, Elder Branson sent out a letter to all of the conference and union conference presidents, institutional presidents and managers, notifying them, warning them that this ruling is going to come down, and to paraphrase, we need to get our act together with regard to the racial restrictions that have come into our institutions. And notice what he says. Adventists, this is the General Conference president, are trailing behind the procession of major change in race relations and in danger of being the last of the Christian bodies to chart a new course. Well, what I would like to talk about today, I think, is a very significant part of the answer to the question of what happened. Bontom says Adventists started solid on the race question. Now, he gives, his answer says a lot, compromise to appease the South, but there's more to it. There is an episode in our history that I think has been overlooked to a large degree, pretty much lost to our historical consciousness, although I and some others have been trying to revive it recently, that I think is an important transition that accounts for how this change came about from a good start, a solid start, to being even behind most of the other Christian bodies. Now, I want to say that there is a theological or ecclesiological premise that I'm, even though my field is history, I'm also, of course, interested in theology, but more than that, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. So, I just want to acknowledge that this is what you could say an assumption or presupposition, but that racial healing is integral to the vocation of Adventism. In other words, it's not simply a matter of justice, of rectifying a grievous wrong. It definitely is that. It's not a matter of just being relevant, but it is integral. It's at the heart of the vocation of Adventism. Loma Linda University, to make men whole. Is that still the motto? Regardless, racial healing, I think, can come under that vision of a mission of restoration of the image of God in humanity in preparation for the second advent. That's one way, anyway, of stating the vocation of Adventism, but you could simply go to the three angels' messages and to talk about a message to every nation, tongue, and people, and so forth, and connect it that way as well. But there's also a historical argument, and that's where my title, American Originals, comes in. Well, let me get to that in a moment. But let's just state or note the historical argument here, that there was a defining moment of opportunity and crisis in the Adventist Church that took place in Washington, D.C. around the turn of the 20th century. We'll use the dates 1889 to 1909. That's what I was speaking about a moment ago, that I think is such a critical part of our history that has been largely overlooked. Well, so it's the story of how an American original now has to contend with America's original sin. Paul Conkin, historian, wrote a book several years ago on American Originals, Homemade Varieties of Christianity. So these are Christian movements, the Church of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science, also the Disciples of Christ, Churches of Christ movement, and the Seventh-day Adventists are what he calls American Originals. And so now the opportunity that I speak of, I think was remarkable in that here Well, I would suggest that Adventists have an opportunity to move forward on that solid start, that good start that was noted earlier. And in the nation's capital, prophetic witness to the power of the gospel to heal the nation's original sin. I'll try to show how that happens, but I'm just stating this in advance. But then it turns out to be a conflict and a crisis in which I will argue that racial injustice became structural in the Adventist church, and that the denomination for the first time faced the threat of racial schism. Now, before I go further, I'll just say parenthetically here that some of my historian friends are not quite convinced when I say that this is the first major racial crisis. It wasn't the first racial incident. It wasn't the first time the problem had come up, but now it's at it reaches the heart of the structure of the denomination. And furthermore, I may be getting ahead of myself just a moment here, but I'll say it in case I forget. No, we're getting to it. Sorry. All right. In this first major racial crisis, the outcome set the direction for the next half century, at least, maybe longer. All right. So here is the broader historical context. And Henry Louis Gates Jr. has summed it up well in his recent book, The Stony Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. The setting is this transition from Reconstruction during the 1860s and 1880s, after the Civil War, where there are some very promising developments in race relations, to the rise of Jim Crow, in which segregation is institutionalized, legalized, systematized in the South. But really, we see a regression of racial attitudes in a harsher direction nationwide. Eric Foner calls Reconstruction a stunning and unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy, but it ended in compromise with the South that then leads to the Jim Crow era. So this is, I'm going over some things quickly here in an effort to set the context, and without going into much detail, but let's just look at a couple of things that help just bring this into focus. After Reconstruction, in this 1890s to 1910 period, which is the setting for the episode that we want to look at in Adventism, Congress permitted the white South to reduce blacks to a state of peonage, indebtedness, to disregard their civil rights, and to disenfranchise them by force, intimidation, and statute. So the transition to that worsening is underway. Just a couple, again, just for a general impression, look at the racial reversal when it comes to lynchings. These statistics are from the Tuskegee Institute archives. In 1884, you had more white people being lynched. I suppose, you know, this is still where we have the Wild West and so forth, but look how it reverses. Lynching becomes a much more racialized issue in the South, and that's part of the intimidation that sort of puts a threat of terror behind anybody who would step outside of the restrictions of Jim Crow. We mentioned Congress. Look at this. In the Reconstruction era, 1871, 5 African Americans in the US Congress. By 1875, it reaches 8. But then in this reaction, where the federal government backs off of enforcing equal rights in the South, and Congress made that allowance on the screen we looked at earlier, the reduction begins. By 1889, there are only 3. By 1891, we have 1, George White of North Carolina. But 1901, He makes his farewell speech, and for the next 28 years, there is no African-American representation in the U.S. Congress. And Oscar DePriest of the Chicago area won in 28 and entered in 29. But I think it was another couple decades. I think Adam Clayton Powell of New York was the next one in the late 40s or 50s before there was even another African-American in Congress. So this just illustrates the change, just to give us a sense of the context, what's going on in the nation at this time. W.E.B. Du Bois put it this way: the slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again toward slavery. Now, in the Adventist church, now we move to what's happening with the Adventists in this context. And we have Charles Kinney, who is the first African-American in sort of the period of denominational organization. Recently, there has been discovered Ari L. Barr in the early period, 1850s, was a fairly prominent Adventist minister, traveling, they called them traveling evangelists. No, there's another term I'm not quite getting. But he went around with Joseph Bates and others, definitely was a recognized Adventist, credentialed Sabbatarian Adventist minister. He died in 1864. But Charles Kinney now is ordained in 1889 in Nashville. But this camp meeting at which he was ordained was also a major incident in how the racial saga develops in Adventism. Now, I should say at this point probably that there are only a couple very small African-American congregations in the South. Soon there will be more. There are a goodly number, I think more than we realize, but we're discovering more and more, who were Adventists, and there was really not much of an issue made for Black Adventists being part of a congregation, and most of them were in the North or the Midwest, because, for lack of a better way of saying it, they weren't a threat. If there was just, say, one family or two or three. So there were a lot of those. We don't know how many, but 50 to 100 would be a conservative estimate. But all of this is just to say that the work among Adventist work among African Americans is really at its earliest stages. And in the South, where the vast majority still are living at this point, it really is barely beginning. But here comes Kinney. But the meeting is it's the Nashville camp meeting and institute, and they used to, I mean, typically at such meetings, this was before the union conferences, but this was the Southern District, and so they had a camp meeting, they had organizational meetings, and a Bible Institute, all kind of rolled into one. But the fact that there were Black people coming on to the campground, and there seemed to be sort of this intermingling of Black and white, at least according to the account of Robert M. Kilgore, who was the head of the Southern District, and others, that they weren't getting the outside attendance. In other words, and I meant to say this a minute ago, this was also evangelism. In other words, they wanted people to come out at night for the preaching for evangelistic purposes, but they said they can't get the white people to come because they see that there is racial mixing on the campground. And so Kinney, apparently it was really a rather embarrassing incident when he brought his friends and family there to the campgrounds. We don't know all of the details, but Kinney is a very shrewd and very, I think, selfless, for lack of a more precise word, figure. And he's forward-looking. And so he says, look, we, and I paraphrase, we recognize that in order to get the message to both races, here in the South, where there's such a harsh color line, that it'd be better. We'd rather not come in and be treated like second-class citizens in a general meeting. In other words, told to sit in the back, or whatever. It'd be better to have our own meetings. Let us be in charge of them. And eventually let us have our own churches and our own conferences. That would be, in this situation, that would be better than just being controlled and dominated within the setting where maybe the general meeting, but they're put in the back or whatever and humiliated that way. Now, Kilgore writes in the review, and he says, we must, if we're going to evangelize in the South, we can't have the races mix. I should also say, because I think it's important, it shouldn't be passed over, Kinney also, as part of his proposals, he said we need to have continuing education to help people see how the third angel's message should break down all these distinctions. So he was not, Kinney was not saying that it's okay, we should just let it go. But he said, given the conditions, here what we ought to do provisionally, but we need also to be bringing people along so that they understand that this is not really acceptable as a lasting solution. Well, anyway, this is pretty well known in Adventist history, accounts of the racial history of Seventh-day Adventism. But less known is a response, well, the story in Washington, D.C. that is really triggered when James H. Howard reads in the review Robert M. Kilgore's report of this meeting, and which he's calling for a color separation policy. And James H. Howard was horrified. Now, we need to say a little bit about who he was first before we take the story further, because he is a central player and I think a very significant figure in our history. He was born in 1861 in Brookville, Maryland, Howard County, north of the Washington, D.C. area. And he was quite an intellectual phenomenon. He earned a BA from Howard at the age of 18, went on to get his MD in 1883, again, top of his class. He did not practice medicine for a living, at least not very much, and there are a number of possible reasons for that. But he did get a good job in the federal government, in the civil service. It's actually in the pension office of the War Department, as it was known back then. Now, note that date, 1886. We're kind of just between Reconstruction and the reaction. It's really not till the presidency of Woodrow Wilson began in 1913 that the federal government hiring really becomes much more racist, and the policies in the federal government offices, they were never fully equal. But all of this is to say that there were some opportunities, and James Howard had a fairly significant degree of prominence in the bureaucracy there, and was well known in Washington, D.C., in the Black community there. At this time, Washington, D.C. had the largest concentration of African Americans than any other city. And since there were relatively good job and educational opportunities, there was quite a substantial professional middle class, and there was even an elite wealthy class. And Howard was a part of these higher echelons, and again, large higher echelons, sociologically speaking, of the Black community in Washington. He married Isabella Marion Cook. Her husband had been the dean of Howard Law School. He passed away. Their son, Will Marion Cook, was a pretty famous African-American musician, classical composer. Somebody told me recently that he actually went to Battle Creek College for a semester or so. He didn't remain an Adventist, at least not a practicing one. But this is just to illustrate how prominent he was and how amazing in view. I mean, James Howard, what the kind of the circles that he was part of, which to me highlights how amazing it was that when the Seventh-day Adventists finally got into a concerted effort to evangelize in Washington, D.C. It wasn't until 1886 they started a city mission, which was really just a house with a few workers, a minister and his wife, and a few students and younger people going out door to door, selling literature, giving literature away, trying to stir up an interest. And James Howard was almost certainly the first Black Washingtonian to accept the message. There was no church, but he is part of the group now that becomes the first congregation, Seventh-day Adventist congregation in Washington, D.C. Eva B. Dykes, many of you have heard of, first African-American and female to earn the PhD in 1921, but he was a mentor and a father figure and an uncle, I should say. I said the slide is not, oh, niece, yeah, father figure and niece for Eva B. Dykes. All right, I could go on and on about Howard, but remember now that we brought him on the scene because he was horrified by this proposal by Kilgore that there be a color separation policy in the Adventist work. And so he writes to the General Conference president. Now, this slide is just to add the detail that this church, first church to be organized of Adventists in DC, that took place in 1889. It had an interracial membership right from the start, total number of 26. Now, only a few months after that is when this incident we refer to happens, and Howard writes the General Conference president. And his letters are, I just find them so eloquent and powerful. He writes, I am especially convinced that if we compromise with this worldly hatred, which Americans call prejudice, while professing to have the love of Christ in our hearts, to have the purest light of the gospel, to be looking for the early advent of the Savior, and to be keeping the commandments, they, that is African Americans, would consider us the most pronounced hypocrites of all professing Christians. This is the prompt for me to suggest with James H. Howard that racial healing is at the heart of the vocation of Adventism. Restoration of the pure light of the gospel, looking for the early advent of the Savior, keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. You see, so this was not just a social or political issue from his standpoint. This is what it meant to be an Adventist. Now, I might just pause to say that I think for me, a fair-minded look at this has to recognize that Howard is writing from a different situation. Kilgore and Kinney are facing different circumstances, but Howard's story has been overlooked, and I think has something important to say to us that broadens our understanding. All right, I will hasten on. He later writes Elder Olson again in January 1890, just a few months later. It seems to me that the more nationalities we can have in the church, the more like the future state the church will be, and the more evidence of the Holy Spirit, which alone would harmonize all of these, this would be a strong evidence in favor of the truth. Now, I just think this is a very impressive statement, and sort of our ministers and teachers through the years have said wonderful things, but to me, this is really about as an effective sort of compression of crucial points. Ecclesiology, eschatology, pneumatology, apologetics, all rolled into one there. But anyway, that is James H. Howard and his protest about the suggestion of a color line in the church. It would just be a betrayal of what we're about in his view. And it correlated with his experience there in Washington, in which the church was racially integrated. Now, the thing of it is, and here is where I try to support, one way I try to support my point, that this is not the first major racial crisis. It's an incident, but it doesn't settle the issue by any means. It's left up for grabs, so to speak. There's conflict over it, because look at what Ellen White said in her famous talk, which later put into a tract and then later in the book, The Southern Work, Our Duty to the Colored People. At the General Conference of 1889, resolutions were presented in regard to the color line. Such action is not called for. Let not men take the place of God, but stand aside in awe and let God work upon hearts, both white and black, in his own way. He will adjust all these perplexing questions. We need not prescribe a definite plan of working. Leave an opportunity for God to do something. We should be careful not to strengthen prejudices that ought to have died just as soon as Christ redeemed the soul from the bondage of sin. Now, I think it's important to say that she doesn't say never, never, under any circumstances, have racially separate meetings, but she's saying, don't make a hardline policy. Leave room for God to work, and whatever you do, try to do it in such a way that you don't strengthen prejudice. But the other pertinent thing here is that she's directly countering Kilgore. The proposal to turn it into a policy to create a color line, the prophet speaks out against. And so that sort of, and by the way, W.C. White made sure that James H. Howard got a copy of this pamphlet. And so that's what made the people in the Washington church and elsewhere feel that color line policy was not what the Adventist church should do. And furthermore, that they had the support of Ellen G. White in that regard. So the church grows in the framework of that time. It's pretty substantial growth. By 1899, it has about 150 members, about 50 of which are Black. And one of them is pictured here. This is Rosetta Douglas Sprague. She's the daughter of Frederick Douglass. She was not a full-time activist by any means like her father, but yet sometimes she did make a speech, do a little writing, and she's a powerful writer and speaker, according to the testaments that were given. I won't go into that much more fully, but she's a significant figure, not simply because of her parentage. And we have discovered, I found some confirmation. Kevin Burton of now at Andrews University found a newspaper article that really makes it beyond question. You know, sometimes you wonder, oh, so-and-so was an Adventist. Yeah, oh, well, and you think, well, it's a legend or a myth, but in this case, no question about it, she was a Seventh-day Adventist and part of this remarkable congregation. Albion F. Ballinger, who conducted revivals and kind of stayed at the church for an extended period of time, a few months, kind of typical pattern then. He wrote this in 1899. This church, he's talking about this congregation in Washington, D.C., is a living miracle of the power of God, composed as it is of the two races. The harmony which prevails is a great surprise to the members of other churches. So he's talking about other denominations. And just let me remind you of a couple of the contextual things. 1899, now we're at the point where the nation is becoming more racist, and that is reflected in the churches as well. And remember the ratio that I mentioned, about a third, about 50 out of 150. This is significant because it's not as if there was some absolute color line in most of the Adventist churches. But to have a large number, a number that's soon would be seen even more strikingly to grow faster than the white membership, that is where the problems tend to come. And indeed, they did come here, but it remains, I think, a striking example, if you will, instance from history that is worth looking at because of the fact that for several years you have a genuinely racially mixed congregation, not just with one dominant race and a very small minority representation. A living miracle of the power of God, says Ballinger. All right, so just summing up a couple points here. It sustains we haven't talked about it, but perhaps many of you are familiar with the fact that during the Civil War era, Adventists were outspoken, and leading up to it, outspoken abolitionists in their views, and very strong and clear on that. But it's also countercultural. It's going against the nation now is shifting. The famous historian C. Van Woodward called this a capitulation to racism, a national capitulation to racism. But this group of Adventists, anyway, is resisting that cultural shift. And it becomes central now to this crisis that is about to come. And the question is, what's going to be the direction that the church is going to take racially? Will this congregation be the example, be the model, or would something else be? Well, we need to jump now to January 1902. And A.G. Daniels, we're going to come back to Washington in a moment, but there's an important connection here. A.G. Daniels has just been elected to the top executive position of the General Conference, 1901. And he is a very strong leader. And he recognizes that the racial issue is really something that Adventists are going to have to grapple with. And he, soon after he went into office, the summer after he went into office, he visited Washington, 1901, summer of 1901. And they had tent evangelism every year, every summer. That he noticed there that the Black people were much more active in attending the meetings, bringing their friends. Some of the white members attended, but very few from the outside. Now we have to remember he's, as we'll see later, there's reason to kind of have to take everything with a recognition that he's looking at it from his perspective. But he then, he says, look at these great Black churches in Washington, D.C. of other denominations. And it's true, there's many famous historic ones. And he said, why can't we do that? We can thrive among both races, but we need to be separate. Now, what was happening in Nashville was the organizational finalization of the organization of the Southern Union Conference. And at this meeting, Daniels gets an agreement not written down on paper. Well, remember what Ellen White said it 10 years before. We shouldn't be making a color line. So Daniels says, there may have been other reasons. But he went to great efforts to ensure that he got agreement on these principles about how we're going to address the racial problem as in Adventist mission, that no effort be made to bring about an equality of the races, nor join the popular cry of elevating the colored man. In other words, we're not going to get involved in public activism for racial equality. And then that we advise separate meetings of the races in those parts of the country where it causes offense for them to mix. All right, so this is a continuation of the Kilgore policy, but it's still unsettled and still contentious because even Daniels feels that they can't officially put it on the record, but he put it down in letters that he wrote to other Union Conference presidents. So this is something real, and it's something that he was very serious about. So this is Daniel's Nashville policy. Well, now the next step in our story is that he sees Washington, D.C. as the testing ground for the Nashville policy, because there's a relatively large Adventist church there, and there's a great opportunity for evangelism. So he says, here's what we ought to do the next summer, 1902. See, the Southern Union meeting again was in January. Now, here's what we'll do in Washington in the summer. We'll have 2 evangelistic meetings run concurrently, one for white people, one for black people. We'll have a white minister, J.S. Washburn, preach for the white people, and a black minister, fairly new on the scene. He's only the 3rd black Adventist minister to be ordained, but we'll have him come and preach for the black people. And then hopefully they'll bring in, they'll grow the churches. I mean, they'll grow the number of converts. And then at the end of the series in September, we will then divide the one congregation into 2 that implicitly would be divided by race. Now, I want to say again that he's not doing this, Daniels, is not doing this out of some kind of evil malevolence. He's a very practical leader, and he has, there's some rationale to it. Again, look at what's going on in other denominations. They thrive on a separate basis. Let's try to do that. But the thing that happens here is that Lewis Sheaf kind of upset the apple cart. He didn't stay within the bounds of the Daniels plan. And Daniels thought that he had Sheaf's agreement, and I think that he did have. What Sheaf said was, well, okay, I'll do that, what you suggest. And then if the white people want to leave and have a separate church out, after the evangelistic effort is over, I won't try to stop them. But I should not be the one. Please don't expect me to be the one to enforce this. So there's no question that that was stipulated. But Daniels convinced himself that he had more of a sympathetic support from Sheaf rather than a somewhat grudging one in terms of going along with this policy. Well, we'll go on here and see what happens with Sheaf. He had been a Baptist minister. He accepted Adventism in Battle Creek in 1896. John Harvey Kellogg said, we don't have a white minister that can begin to stand next to him. So he was a gifted orator, and he caught fire, one way of putting it, in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1902. And the newspaper headlines here really say it all. New faith comes, thrilling success of a Seventh-day Adventist. Reverend Lewis C. Sheaf stirs Washington by his persuasive eloquence and convincing logic, and etc. That's the Colored American with his picture there. Pardon me. That was one of two Black-owned newspapers in the city, but the central clipping here is from the Washington Post. Thousands hear him. Negro minister draws large crowds to his tent. Now, of course, this is all wonderful from Daniel's standpoint. What's the problem? Well, the way in which he's breaking the mold is that there are a lot of white people who are coming to these meetings. And Cooper, in his Colored American paper, says that Sheaf's meetings are nightly crowded by the best citizens of the district of every faith and of both races, who flock to hear his convincing, logical, and matchless eloquence. And this is not the only evidence we have that a large, substantial number of white people were attending, even coming down from Capitol Hill for the evening meeting to hear Sheaf. Furthermore, Sheaf, I'm going to back up for a minute. Oh, now I messed it up. Yeah. Was baptizing more whites than J.S. Washburn was at his meetings, which were for the white people. Because I've tried to look at all of the reports carefully, and Washburn actually does not even claim any specific number of baptisms. He talks about some people that he's working with, a physician who is prominent, and Washburn is quite a writer, quite a promoter, and it makes it sound wonderful, but when it comes, and he makes it sound like he's the only one in town, that this is really, the main thing. But when it comes down to it, he doesn't really say that any had joined the church through his meetings, whereas Sheaf baptized eventually about 75 to 80 baptisms, accessions to the Adventist church were attributed to Sheaf's meetings, and about 15 to 20 of those were white people. So this just throws off Daniel's calculus. The other thing that throws off Daniel's calculus is that there is a substantial contingent, really about half of the white members of the Washington congregation, who are adamantly against the racial division. James Howard writes, this is actually before the meeting started, but it was even more so afterwards, that one of the strongest points of the Adventist cause in Washington among many white and colored people outside the church has been that with regard to race, the race question, the Adventists were following the Christian course. And he goes on to say, we're attracting attention now, and positive attention in many people's minds for this. And this was even then more true by the end of the summer meetings. But Elder Daniels and the other church leaders determined to carry through this separation. And so that took place. I started to say, but should probably finish the point, that by this time then, Sheaf is seen as defying Daniels because, again, Sheaf said, well, whatever the people on the ground want to do, I won't oppose it. But now he's finding that at least half the white people on the ground don't want to separate. And so he uses his eloquence now to speak out on how this is actually the true Christian course. But they went ahead with the separation, and look at these headlines. Color line drawn between Adventists. That just kind of, to me, that kind of socks you in the gut right there. The church in Washington to be divided on race lines. Whites will form separate church, and so forth. This story got picked up nationwide, not front page, but it made the New York Times. I've probably found about 15 papers by now, and that's subject to a lot of variables. And it's a very interesting thing to see how they spin the story differently. Some think that it's a good thing and sort of make a positive explanation for it, but others decry it. Anyway, so here is the reaction of W. Calvin Chase, who was the editor of the other black paper, the Washington Bee, and his reaction to this separation on the part of the Adventists along racial lines, even in this new religious organization, American original in our terms, even in this new religious organization, the spirit of caste is being fostered and perpetuated. Every offshoot of American Christianity partakes of venom of the parent tree race prejudice. So it's like Chase is saying, well, Adventists, they may be we're looking like they might be different, but no, they're really just the same. They, in fact, partake as fully of or are under the thrall of America's original sin as much as the others. Now, here is the leader. He's the elder of the church, speaking for about half the white members who stay with the black, and you have then what they called the first church. They said that we want to be known as the first church at Washington, D.C. And he writes to Elder Daniels, "We are fully convinced that God's people should stand united before the world, so as to show by actual facts and real lives that God has real power to convert men and women wherever they are born or to whatever position in society that they have attained from any wrong thing, yes, even race prejudices, which are lodged deeper than some other evil habits." So there was a real idealism on the part of a considerable contingent of the white as well as the black members of this congregation, 122 black and 46 white after the division. And the other group joins under Elder Washburn, became known as the Memorial Church. Now, notice what Washburn says. This is a few months later, and although Daniels became very upset with Sheaf for not supporting the separation, he kind of calmed down when he realized how many people were joining the church as a result of Sheaf's meetings, and so he kept Sheaf on. Sheaf is on the General Conference payroll. It's going to support him for another series of evangelistic series in 1903. Washburn is not happy about that. And he writes to Ellen White, to W.C. White, saying that this first church, they preach a political gospel, which brings in many colored people. In fact, the church is growing wonderfully. So he recognizes that it's growing, but he says it's a political gospel. And for Washburn, it is bad news that this church is doing so well. Why? Because a mold, that is a shape, a pattern, is being put upon the work for this for the colored people. That is terrible. A mold which I fear will take a long time to change. So that's really what's at stake here. What's the mold going to be? Howard speaks in the same language. The mistakes that have been made in this place, that is the separation, will surely spoil the pattern for the future, both for the world and for the cause, whereas other people and denominations have done this. People of both races in and out of the truth regard this as awful in a people of Adventist profession who are endeavoring to teach the world to prepare for the coming of the Lord. Are the leaders right? In other words, he wants to know what the prophet has to say about whether Daniels and the other conference leaders are they done right, and is this the stamp the mold, the pattern that we are to place upon the cause of truth. Well, let me just pause for a moment, and I have kind of lost track of time here. There's actually a part 2 to this story that I think we can still do before the break, unless you tell me otherwise. It won't be as long. But
how long is it, Dr. Morgan?
Oh, maybe another 15, 20 minutes. Is that
I'm going to suggest that we take the break now.
okay? All right.
And then we'll take 10 minutes and then we'll come back. This is very exciting information. And
Okay.
so I'm going to suggest that we take a 10-minute break, come back at 5 minutes to 12 our time.
Okay.
And that way, those of us who need to stop in certain places can.
All right. Yes, indeed.
So, but thank you very much. And Monty, he's our sheriff today. If you have questions later, you want to raise your hand, he'll recognize you. So let's take a 10-minute break. And Dr. Morgan, kind of withdraw yourself from the screen because people will want to be talking to you in the meantime. So,
Okay.
all right. I do got you, Simona.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for your patience, and I'm going to try to wrap it up as succinctly as I can. But there is one more important part of this story. I hope that we have shown how the racial policy in the church was a contested matter, and how Washington, D.C. became a testing ground, a conflict over what policy would be pursued, and how it ended up with the decision to pursue a racially separatist policy prevailing. Now, let's go back to the screen. But some other decisive developments are yet to take place. So Dr. Howard sums up his objections to what has happened thus far. I tell you plainly, Brother Daniels, with all respect, that you and your committee are grievously wrong in your course and policy on the race question. And you are wrong at a time when the world is growing worse in this respect, and so much needs your wise and corrective influence. I think this is such an important passage because it shows that Howard has a broader vision. Yes, a lot of what's driving him is that he wants a pure restoration of the gospel. He wants Adventism to be pure. But why? The world needs it so much. But the story's not over, as I've said. There is a second order possibility. And especially for people today who are highly principled, idealistic in these terms, it may be a little difficult to think of this in a possibly positive way. But regardless of what you think of that, I hope that you will consider the historical significance of what's happening here. A second order possibility remains open. That is racially targeted ministries with parity, respect, and fair representation. In other words, the Charles Kinney model. To put it another way, separate but equal per the 1896 Supreme Court decision, but truly equal. Now, to show how that was more thinkable back then, well, for one thing is, as I noted earlier, I think it's a testament to how much these early Black Adventists and those since, how passionately devoted they are to Adventism and its message, that they couldn't approve and they couldn't feel good about racial separation, but they were willing to say, all right, if you white people want that, you insist on that, we're, okay, we'll live with that. But there's a difference between that and outright unfairness, unequal access to institutions, unequal distribution of resources. I'm going to hurry over these quotes from Edward Cooper. Again, he's the editor of the Colored American. But he's saying, look, let's not get all bent out of shape about this, because, well, really the Adventists are not doing anything that's not the usual thing. Again, James Howard would say, well, can't we can't we transcend the social customs? But Cooper, remember, he's the editor of one of the main black papers, that let's not get too upset about them for this reason. And I will read a little bit here. As a matter of fact, Cooper says the colored followers of the Seventh-day Adventists will be better pleased to be under their own government, administered and controlled in their own way, and pastored by a man of God in whom they have confidence, and from whom they can expect sincere sympathy in every relation of life. And of course, the man was Lewis C. Sheaf. And so A.G. Daniels now adapts his strategy. Now, the year, okay, that's October 1902, but now we're coming up on 1903. And those of you who know your Adventist church history, your denominational history, and can keep the dates lined up, this is a very important year, because the General Conference is moving its headquarters from Battle Creek to Washington, D.C., Tacoma Park, straddling the border there. And now the stakes for Adventism denominationally in all of this are only that much greater. Publishing house is moving there. School, sanitarium are going to be started in Washington, D.C. How are we going to approach this? Well, Daniels decides, all right, let me continue to support Sheaf, but encourage him, rather than building up the first church even larger, to start a separate church, which was indeed in a different part of the city. In Daniel's mind, and in most people's mind, and to a significant degree of reality, this was a black church. It never was 100%, and they never accepted the, in principle, Sheaf and his congregation never accepted the idea of any kind of racial exclusion or separateness, hence the name, the People's Church. It's open to all people. But and A.T. Jones says that there were some black members, and that's probably true. I mean, excuse me, some white, but it was really the first major Black Adventist congregation. Now, they acquired this nice building in June 1905. It's at 10th and V Street, which is right near the U Street corridor, which was sort of the main center of cultural activity in Washington, D.C. for the Black community. So it was beautifully located. Now, look at Daniels. He says, all right, well, as the matter is arranged now, I think we can please anybody and everybody on the color question. We have a white church that is under Washburn, the Memorial Church, for those who want an unmixed white congregation. We have a church for the colored people, that's the People's Church. And we have a mixed church where the white and black can both unite. That's the first church. And he says, I think this is ideal. We shall do all we can to build up the interests of all three. And he says the brethren seem to be coming into harmony. And indeed, there was a period of about 2 years in which it seemed like this would prosper, that these three congregations could work together as part of a little, eventually what became a conference, District of Columbia Conference. But anyway, but what we need to look at then is, well, how did that actually work out? He says, we will do all we can to build up the interests of all three. Well, what it comes down to is a comparison of how much money was put into these projects. Back to J.S. Washburn for a minute. Remember, I said that he didn't really baptize very many. In 1902, he got maybe about 40 people who had been members of the original congregation. And he managed to convince the denomination, this is just back a few months chronologically, but it's before the decision to move to Washington, D.C. was made for the General Conference. But he got the General Conference Committee to endorse a campaign to raise $10,000 for this memorial church that they acquired. So it wasn't an outright appropriation, but it was the next best thing. And enthusiastic support in the union papers, as well as the Review, the repeated calls for funds for our cause in Washington, D.C. And again, all these reports are being put out as if this was the real work in Washington, D.C., when in fact, the much more, much larger and more vibrant work on the ground was being carried out at the First Church and then at this new People's Church. People's Church. Interestingly enough, it cost about $10,000 to acquire the lot and this structure. And so the obvious question now is, well, how much are you going to put in to this General Conference? Are you going to support this in anything like an equitable way? Well, it turns out no. And Daniels actually later acknowledged that this was a mistake. He claims that, well, I was for it, but the committee, I couldn't get it through the committee. But he recognized that this looked really bad. But there's something else. What became Washington Missionary College, now Washington Adventist University? What became the Washington Sanitarium and Hospital, later just hospital? Well, what is going to be the racial situation there? Are Black people going to be able to be treated at the sanitarium? Are they going to be able to be trained as nurses there, or what have you? It's a significant issue of opportunity in and of itself. Not to mention our school. Are they going to be able to attend the school that's being built in Tacoma Park? And remember, this is on the heels of this disparity on the building. Well, turns out that the amount raised, and by the way, Washburn was placed in charge of raising the money for the move and the building up of the new institutions. $150,000 campaign. Well, does it? You might guess, how much of this money was appropriated for the Black work in Washington, D.C.? Well, wait for it. Let's see. I think it was, yes, zero. All right. So now the People's Church says, wait a minute. Here we are paying tithe. We're supporting the offering funds. But we're not being allowed access to these institutions. And it was more than just, I might as well go ahead and give the first point of this petition that they send. They very effectively portrayed this, and I think sincerely portrayed it, that we believe that this third angel's message this third angel's message has to go to all people, and it's urgent. This generation, all of that. But we are not able to take advantage of these things having to do with health and education that are so central to that message. So they wanted an equal share in the identity and privileges and the evangelistic mandate. And the problem is, well, no schools, hospitals, and sanitariums are under our control or, to the best of our knowledge, for our use. So the question is, are we privileged to accept the services and benefits of the schools, hospitals, and sanitariums under the control of the General Conference or any subordinate or connected entities? And they wanted a straight answer. If no, we request the privilege of using but they're referring to their congregation, tithes and offerings for the purpose of creating such facilities as its work may demand from time to time. So that's one solution. And remember, they're willing and eager to remain Seventh-day Adventists. But this disparity, where not only do we have this separation policy, but there's no nothing even close to equality when it comes to the schools and the hospitals and so forth. While we're supposed to pay into the system, that was just too much. All right, and so the GC committee response was not direct. It's basically form a committee, talk about it, and wait. But the reality, and everybody knew it. In fact, there was correspondence to indicate that no way were they going to admit Black people to the school or have a racial integration into Tacoma Park. In fact, Daniel said that he had a conversation with Chief about it. He said, if we do that, then the people around are going to burn it down. Now, you know, maybe he was exaggerating. And he said that Chief said, well, let them burn it. It'll just strengthen our witness. But anyway, so the People's Church response was, all right, well, we'll go ahead. We're going to withdraw from the conference organization. They remained Seventh-day Adventists in belief and practice. They continue to use the Sabbath School quarterly and so forth, but they were independent Seventh-day Adventists. So I wanted to include this because it really shows, I think this is a point at which we can say that a racial policy had been made and executed and embedded and made by the General Conference Committee, at least in effect, and was embedded into the institutions of Adventism. So I probably didn't have time to stress enough what an opportunity this was in the summer of 1902 through Chief's evangelism and through the example that the church had set up to that point. This is really an opportunity to take that solid start and to take the lead. Imagine Adventists being known for, if not full racial integration, at least being ahead on racial matters and addressing racial injustices and giving opportunities for African Americans in the same way that we became known for healthcare. But instead, this becomes Adventism's first denominational crisis over race relations. Racism, segregation, and inequality become embedded in the denominational institutions, and it leads to an era of racial schism. Chief and the People's Church withdraw. They come back again, but once again, nothing really happens to resolve the issues. Chief is there on the right, as I'm looking at it. In the middle is John W. Manns. He and Chief and Manns joined temporarily in 1916 to form the Three Seventh-day Adventists. They later split up, sorry. But this Free Seventh-day Adventist group was probably the most significant denominational, separate denomination of Black Adventists in terms of lasting for about 20 years and having a goodly number of congregations in the South and in Costa Rica and Jamaica. Probably the best known is James K. Humphrey, but look at it, really, it's pretty close in terms of the years. So this is really almost, you could say, a spate of very powerful, effective Black ministers. James K. Humphrey, for those who may not have heard of him, in New York City, and he builds up the work there, church of about 600 plus several other churches that he planted, but similar issues. And he forms the United Sabbath-day Adventists. That was not even as successful as the Free Seventh-day Adventists in terms of a denomination, but it hurts the Black work. It hampers it. But Black Adventism is not defeated in all of that. But unfortunately, the trajectory is set for this backslide to the rear of the procession that W.H. Branson noted in 1954. Well, I just have to say briefly, I'm wrapping it up here, but to speak for the loyal Black Adventists who stayed with the denomination despite it all of this, and remember Howard's eloquent idealism. But he said, look, no condition brought about by the errors of our conference brethren would justify Brother Sheaf in taking the extreme position that he did. Don't separate from the cause. Men don't own the cause, nor the denomination. And he says, I'll never move. But I like that sentence, because sometimes we may feel a little frustrated about what the current leaders might be doing or might not be doing. But it's good to remember, they don't own the cause. They might have influence for a while, but they don't own it. So he's a powerful example, not only of racial healing and vocation, as central to the vocation of Adventism, that we live toward the New Jerusalem for the sake of the world. And also in his response to racial injustice, he spoke out. He was loyal, but not uncritically loyal. We conclude with my Angelou history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. All right, so I will conclude there, and if there's any question, discussion, we'll be happy to respond as best I can.
Okay, thank you very much. I see hands are popping up, and before Monty recognizes, let me ask you a question, Dr. Morgan. I've worked in the East here for the church, and I've worked here in the West, and I've been in connection with administrative work in the East. My question to you is, are there other reasons for separate churches other than race? For instance, style of worship, et cetera, et cetera. When I was in Southern New England, we had a lot of Blacks come to what were traditionally white churches, but they were primarily West Indian origin. And they didn't want to go to the Northeastern Regional Conference. So I'm just wondering, is using the word segregation, is it always bad, or does it just carry a whole load of stuff that we shouldn't deal with? But recognize that maybe, there are differences. And so I'm just want to know what your opinion on that is.
Right. Yeah, I think that the position of James Howard, that color should not come in to the picture at all in church relations. There's an appeal to that, but there's also the other factors of the realities of human sociology and human sin, social sin, and how do you grapple with that? And really, that's why I suggest that separation really was not the worst of the matter. And that's a backhanded way of saying, sure, and I can think of Black leaders, Adventist leaders that I've known, Elder Bradford, Elder Rock, that I think would support me in saying this, that you shouldn't be forcing from above things that people don't want. So they may self-segregate for various reasons, but nobody's choice should thereby be disallowed. If a Black person prefers sedate classical music and wants to join, I'm tempted to name a church, but I won't. Another church that's predominantly white or whatever, so there needs to be freedom, but sometimes that may be freedom to worship in ways that are most comfortable with your culture. Now, there's a lot of complexity and nuance to that, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn this over to Monty. By the way, Monty, I think we'll go to 1:45, and then at that time we'll go to the afterglow. So Monty, to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Forrest. And thank you for the presentation. That was very, very enlightening. I hadn't heard of those historical happenings. I first have David on my list and then Simona. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you for one question. David V. I'm not able to hear you, David.
David, you're muted.
No, still not able to hear you, David. I may be able to send you an unmute request. Let me try that. Ask to unmute. Let's see if something pops up on your screen. There we go.
There you
Yes,
go.
my question is, I have two questions. The background to the first one is that at the break, you didn't get a chance to comment on the slide where Howard or someone had written to Ellen White in 1903, imploring her to set policy or reconsider her previous ambivalence. And when you came back after the break, you didn't tell what her response was, either to him, the writer, or to the GC or the church as a whole. In other words, did she still just want to let things drift and let the church decide, or did she make a stronger statement at that point? That's my first question. And the second question is, in regards to Willie White and the Morning Star, how does that fit in to her thinking at this time in the early 20th century?
Okay, excellent questions. Let me maybe just start briefly with the second one. Remember that, of course, Ellen White very much encouraged her son in this venture to the south using the Morning Star steamboat. This was just in the range of, late 1890s, mid-late 1890s, is slightly before the main developments in our story in Washington. But they had actually met a violent reaction there in Mississippi. So they had to not have white people working, in racially mixed settings. And I think that this was an important factor in Ellen White herself then taking a little bit more of a position that prudence and the priority, again, like Charles Kinney had said, of getting the message out to both races does require, and the most famous passage is that separate churches in where the racism is strong until the Lord shows us a better way. So the experience of Edson was significant. However, now merging into your first question, she is reluctant. What I have just said was she wrote things in letters, and some church leaders might be privy to these testimonies, and then they would go and share them. But they didn't have the first church in Washington could still insist or ask for clarification, because as far as we know, what's on the record is that she's saying that it should be full equality, that there should not be separation in the congregations, 1891. Well, now she doesn't really respond. She says, just work it out based on what I have already written. She didn't respond to James Howard directly. Sarah McKentifer, her secretary, responded. In 1908, and again, I think this is part of the story that could be brought out a little bit more clearly. If you read Ron Grapel's work, E.G. White and Church Race Relations, it's there. But in 1908, finally, so that's 5 years after the slide that I showed in that letter, the situation in Washington, and believe me, even though I spent an hour and 15 minutes talking about it, it was way more complexity and detail than I could even give. But this thing kept boiling. And finally, A.G. Daniels and W.C. White, I guess, well, their influence was significant, I think, in prompting her to feel that she did have direction from the Lord to write a testimony to the believers in Washington, D.C. And basically, she walked a very difficult tightrope. On the one hand, she said, no lines of absolute exclusion. So we don't want that. And let's remember that God doesn't draw any color lines. There's only one heaven. So remember all that. But because the people in the mixed race church, the first church, they were saying, they're basically, some of the most radical of them were basically saying that you're in apostasy if your congregation is not racially mixed and, not doing it the way we're doing. And so she opposed that. And the reason why that's such a tightrope is, well, where do you draw the line? I mean, if you're going to say, well, there's no line of absolute exclusion, but yet it's okay for the white church to basically be a white church, that's a hard line. But I mean, that's difficult to bring that together. But basically, that's what she does. And I do think that it is not without significance that she reminds them, and all of everything that I've seen along these lines that she's written, she never just lets them off the hook. Look, well, I just stop there. But the de facto impact of it basically was permission in the minds of the church leadership and the white brethren that we can go ahead with the racially separatist policy.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it.
All right, Simona, you're up.
Thank you. I'm going to make a statement that maybe some people are not going to like, but I believe that racism is incompatible with Christianity. You cannot be a follower of Christ and be racist. These two things are just cannot live together. And so I'm perplexed by the fact that the church, just to increase the numbers, decided to include racists into the mix and give them power, and in a way empowered, mediocre white men over the much more competent people. And I'm saying people because they include women in that as well, of color or gender and so on. And I think we are still dealing with the same problem today. It's a legacy that is difficult to shed. And so I think that for as long as we see others, whoever that other is, whether it's because of the color of their skin or their nationality or tribal, you know, a group or sex or sexual identity, or so, as long as we see the other as lesser, we are not following Jesus. And I'm really surprised sometimes by people who claim Christianity, claim Jesus as their leader, who are doing that kind of stuff. And so on one hand, what I notice here is that on one hand, they are not giving possibilities to people of color, but those who did rise, despite that, they were not even given the right to work. You know, they were not given equal access to possibilities to work in the church. And so it's a legacy that is very heavy. And I'm looking at the church today, and I'm looking at the world today, and I see the same problems rising again. We are not leading in the best way, in the way how women are treated, in the way how people of color are treated. And I'm really concerned for the future of the church that is deciding to mollycoddle people who are racist and sexist and so on in order to, you know, get money or whatever, and who keep rising mediocre white men to positions of power, men who otherwise would not be able to be successful anywhere else, to be honest, and deny possibilities to people who are better educated and more capable.
Well, thank you. I think that's eloquently stated. I would just say that one thing that draws me to this history that I've talked about is that it does mean that Adventism doesn't have to be defined by what you just described, that there were people in the name of Adventism, because of, not simply in spite of their Adventism, they had a much grander and authentically Christian, I would say, vision about human equality. And so that's something that we can draw without trying to then just sort of, smooth over and diminish the the severity of the ways in which we went off track.
All right, Forrest, you're up. Or Simona, was that a follow-up to the response, or is it a new question?
No, new question.
Okay, Forrest, and then we'll come back to Simona. Yep, you're on,
Yeah,
Forrest.
gotcha. Do you think we've improved? I mean, our regional conferences of an improvement over what we had? We now have had, at least here in the Pacific Union, we had a Black president for years. Here in Southeastern, when I was in the Atlantic Union, we had Black. It seems like we've moved to a better position, but maybe I'm just trying to be optimistic. What is your feeling?
Well, yeah. In my in the book Change Agents, which in which the I touch on what I presented this morning in that book, but most of it is about people then who were dealing with the leftover consequences, sort of the festering sore that had gone untreated for 30 years. And my argument is that despite their the fact that the primary drivers of this movement, this committee to try to address the issue, were Black, female, and and they were lay members. So in the context of Adventism, I say this is a sort of a triple intersection, if you will, of that they've got to try to overcome, but they didn't accomplish their goals exactly, but that there was a turn. Now, it's uncomfortable for me to say, well, yes, we're really so much better now, and so forth, because I feel a little, handicapped myself in making that kind of assessment. But it is true, unquestionably true, that now we have our second African-American division president. We've had a president of the Southern Union Conference, Ron Smith, African-American. I mean, this is just unthinkable in terms of these earlier decades, and I could multiply the examples.
All right, thank you. I'm conflicted between first question and male-female going back and forth, but I'm going to show my
Go
bias.
to McKinley.
Okay, if you say so, Simone, I will. I was going to go the other way, but McKinley.
Thank you, Monty. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Dr. Morgan,
Yes.
thank you for your excellent presentation. I appreciate it very much. There are many explanations about how there came to be a demographic segmentation of the U.S. Adventist congregation. I found yours to be the best, that gave the best historical context. And I have a few observations and maybe a question. But the observations first. It seems to me that Elder A.G. Daniels was very conflicted and indeed missed an opportunity, as you said. Charles Kinney, Brother Charles Kinney, seemed to be the source of the demographic segmentation of the Adventist Church, although I suppose it was out of a very best motive to deal with circumstances that presented themselves during those early times. Dr. James Howard, in my mind, presents the model for African Americans to address whatever perceived or real grievances they may be exposed to or have realized, either as members of our Adventist church family or in the larger population. And so I just wonder if you care to comment on my observations, but thank you so very much. I found this very edifying.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I don't know that I will add too much. I find that as a historian, when I look at one figure and I see his circumstances and how he's looking at it and how he's dealing with it, I can sort of understand. And so I think that Kinney, what we don't hear enough about, we do hear that Kinney said that once we have enough to make up a congregation, then it should be separate. And then when there's enough of those, we should make a conference. And so, okay, so it's like he's saying that this kind of separation is the best thing that can be done under the circumstances. But we may not say enough about what those circumstances were. In other words, the option was to, I'm going to shift the specific context, but the principle is the same. And that is, you can be part of a conference. And if you're James K. Humphrey, sorry to jump around a little bit, there's no question you're on the conference committee every year, all the time. You have a voice, but you're always outvoted. You have no power, really, even though it's integrated in a sense. So I think that Kinney actually was quite a visionary. And there's one other aspect that we don't emphasize enough. If you look, and I mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. He says, we need to be continually educating people about the way in which the third angel's message overcomes racism and these racial divisions, so that it never gets to a situation where we're doing this to please ourselves, that whatever separation strategies may be used are for that evangelistic purpose. And so that part of it was completely forgot. Well, I could go on and on about some of these, but I'll stop there. And thank you for your kind comments.
May I go on the list?
Yes, Anastasia.
And it's time. Thank you. Short time.
Yeah. So I think let's go with Simona and then Anastasia.
Thank you. So, you know, this country has been built on a slogan, no taxation without representation. And I think you kind of touched on that when you talked about Chief's Church. You know, the reasons why he separated was because they were giving money, but they had no power, no input on how that money was spent. And they received nothing in return. And so, pardon me, the blood of revolutionaries, you know, kind of speaks here, but I don't really understand him. Why would you give money to somebody who doesn't support you, who doesn't give you equal access, equal opportunity? And I think that is a very powerful lesson, I think, as well today. I think if women stopped supporting church that's not supporting them, we would see much faster change. And I think that, you know, there are tools that we have and we should use to empower the change that is necessary, that I believe is required for the church to become what it's supposed to be.
Thank you. Yeah, no, those is well stated. I think the only thing that really separated, say, a Sheaf or a Humphrey or a Manns that says this is intolerable and we're going to have to go independent, and those who remained is a belief that may seem difficult to see the evidence for at times, but the belief that they could make it better if they continued persistence, continued to grow, even though their very growth is being inhibited, because how can you attract Black people into the church if we're these policies? But the point I'm trying to make is that none that I know of were okay with that kind of situation of being part of this and paying and being devoted to it, but then not being able to participate in the institutional life of the church. That was not acceptable to any.
Thank you. Anastasia.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. I really believe you're one of those stars, like Dr. Branson, Dr. David Larson, and this wonderful class, the community in Loma Linda, and the churches and the congregation and people that bring back the light. I had to say, in spite of all this, don't you think it's really shameful that in 2022, we can only say, oh yes, we have now, it's better that we have now a president and vice president who is Black. Yeah, and we had a senator too, and pat ourselves on the shoulder and say how great we do. And no, you did not say that. Isn't it shameful that after Martin Luther King, and isn't it shameful of what is happening today with racism and fascism and everything, that the churches, any churches, and the excuse of the Adventist leadership to say, well, you know, we're not activists. Yes, there are some thugs and burdens and things, but since I'm one of those that I was beaten up in high school in Greece because I was protesting of fascism at that time, and I finally left the country because a person, even before the junta was established, my best friend next to me was killed. And I left my country, my family, and everything else, and I went to Newport. And I feel guilty for that because the others died and were beaten up when I shut up my mouth. Isn't it shameful that we cannot have leaders that can be activists for what is Christ-like? But I thank you, and I thank the people. And I agree with Simone 100%. Christ really said, way, in Greek we say, shameful hypocrites. And it's not time to pat ourselves on our shoulders. It's time, like you and others, to bring forth these terrible injustices to women and Black people and minorities, the least one of them. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for one thing, for the powerful testimony of your experience. I think that something you brought up is well, all of it was important, but one thing in particular that I'll respond to that I think might help clarify where we are. Although again, I speak with great caution and recognition of the limitations of my own perspective when I say this. In terms of representation in church councils and offices, yes, there's no question that that we're in a much better place, and admission to institutions and so on. But my sense is that one of the most difficult areas now is a tendency to dismiss the social and existential conditions that we'll say in particular, although it's many others, but we'll say for our purposes now that Black people in America, many of them face and continually still need to be changed. And I think that a lack of a recognition of those, and in fact, an active dismissal of that as somehow activism that is out of line with our mission and message, I think that might be one of the most difficult problems that we have right now.
All right, Forrest, I'm going to send it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Dr. Morgan. Some very thoughtful words last week and this week, and you're going to be with us for a third time next week, and you're going to talk about something peaceful, right? War. So.
Yes. We are talking about the simple, easy things, right?
Yeah,
no, I really appreciate this opportunity. And I just thank everyone again for joining in, and I'm looking forward to next week as well.
Okay, and by the way, the book Change Agents, you can pick that up on Amazon, Kindle, and I forgot the price, but it's very reasonable to help you in your retirement. So anyway, thank you so much. At this time, let's see, I'm going to have our benediction, and then we'll have our afterglow period of what we call this, the foodless potluck. There you go. My wife had to tell me. So let me just give our benediction. And whoops, I just lost my benediction. Here it is. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Thank you again very much. And Dr. Morgan, we'll see you next week. And I'm going to stop recording. Yep, there we go. And then